So have you guys ever heard of the Dungeon Meshi manga? Ideally you haven't. I mean, this video is for those people, but also for the people who are reading it and also want to know my opinion on it. But yeah. Otherwise known as Dungeon Meal or Dungeon Food or even Delicious in Dungeon. That doesn't feel like good English. Deliciousness in Dungeon. Guys, if we're gonna localize, we need it to make sense, not just directly translate. Anyway, yeah, Dungeon Food. A manga about eating food in a dungeon out of ingredients that you get in a dungeon. This is my quick review of the first 30 chapters. So premise, what is it about? The story takes place in a magical fantasy setting on a particular island where a particular dungeon has appeared. Said dungeon has promised riches to whoever completes it and defeats the evil dungeon master. In the midst of all of this, the main character Leos has just had his sister eaten by a dragon. Don't worry, not a spoiler, it's like the first 5 pages of the material. Leos' party has a party wipe. The sister teleports the party out of the dungeon with her last breath, and due to squabbles, the party reduces in size to 2 other people besides Leos himself. Anyway, they need to save Leos' sister, but they have no money, so sacrifices have to be made. They will find food in the dungeon, since they can't afford to buy anything else and they need to get into that dungeon to save whatever remains of his sister. And at that declaration, the 4th party member reveals himself and goes on to tag along with the party. And this guy is the one that's bringing the gimmick of eating dungeon monsters. But that's pretty much the premise of Dungeon Food. You know, people are going into a dungeon to save a sister, and on the way they're going to eat a bunch of stuff. Moving on to story. So when it comes to story and the way it's told, you're coming into a very solid story. Like, the story writing level is solid. And when I say solid, I mean that the story consistently adheres to its rules and very rarely pulls something out of nowhere that feels cheap. Most developments, surprising or not, are told sensibly, and for a few of them have subtle foreshadowing. Not only that, because this is a fantasy setting, it has some of its internal logic fleshed out as well, and the events that occur don't break that logic all that often, if ever at all, which is honestly really great from a writing standpoint. Chapter to chapter story-wise, there are patterns. For instance, the 4 main characters will occasionally get their individual chapters, and you will be able to tell that you're in one based on how the chapter focused on them at the beginning of the chapter. In these chapters, you can expect to get a lot of internal monologues and maybe flashbacks from the character, along with a character-specific storyline that involves them solving some sort of difficulty. Most importantly of all, these chapters will introduce you to more of the character while also advancing the plot. And since the plot advances as long as the party advances forward into the dungeon, the weaving of character arcs into the overarching narrative feels natural and welcome. Throughout those first 30 chapters, there were times when I was much more interested in the chapter-focused segments than the bare adventure and exposition chapter. The character-focused chapters, throughout those first 30 chapters, there were times when I was much more interested in the character-focused segments than the bare adventure and exposition chapters. The character-focused chapters become less frequent as the chapters roll along, but that's to be expected. You eventually stop getting character-focused chapters per se, and you get more of an adventure chapter with just the character storyline weaved throughout. And yeah, eventually you will have the characters interacting with more of their traits out in the open, so it all feels worthwhile. Another pattern that occurs in chapters is, of course, the food segment. The series is about cooking dungeon food, so of course there'd be a segment that involves detailing what goes into a meal. Thankfully though, it's not long. The actual recipe page is just that, a page, and they spend more time on the ingredient acquisition process, but since that usually involves problem solving or exploring, it feels like a natural consequence of the plot rather than a detour. Occasionally they go over the cooking method, which can be interesting most times since they're dealing with the occasional poisonous or strange monster, where the cooking process informs you of the monster biology and ultimately you're learning new information. I personally usually skim read a lot of the ingredient and reaction page, but I am usually involved with the prep and acquisition page. Also, a lot of times I find myself wishing that the dishes that the characters were eating could give them some sort of magical enhancements, but I guess it's not that type of series, but it's still all good. Anyway, yeah, story writing level overall, solid. Personally, I ultimately don't find it to be super exciting. Like, it's not a sensational type series like My Hero Academia where you could be week to week waiting for the next chapter. For Dungeon Meshi, I'm not really waiting month to month, but it's at the point where if I see a chapter pop up, I'm going to go and read it because I know it's going to be a solid, consistent, good time, right? I very rarely expect to be disappointed as I'm reading these chapters. Next, on to the characters. I find the character writing level to be nuanced. At this level, you can expect the main characters to be reasonable given their backstories. Even if characters act irrationally or have faults to their personality, it still makes sense and can be justified given what you've seen in the story. At this level, you start getting characters that while you may not like them, you can appreciate them and respect what's going into their writing. The comedic tag denotes that there are some qualities that they have that have their root in comedic value. Like say Leia's having an unhealthy desire in eating monsters. That's a comedic flaw. Now mind you, for the first 30 chapters, some characters get more nuance than others, but in the long run, they're all pretty solid. So the 4 main characters in this series at this point in time, altogether, are good if not above average. They're quite the ensemble cast once they've got all their character traits introduced, but you know, their first 30 chapters, 2 of them in particular kind of fall to the wayside. I'll give you some quick descriptions about them though. Leia's, he's the party leader and a human knight. His sister got eaten by a dragon. Then you have Marcille, she's the party mage and an elf from a arcane college. Next you have Chilchuck or Turchak. Honestly, I've seen different translations for this name. I'm just going to call him Chilchuck. He's the party thief, effectively called a locksmith in the story, and he's a halfling. And finally, you have Senshi, the party's cook. He is a dwarf warrior, and he's the main driving force of the cooking gimmick. Now, like I said in the story section, all these characters get chapters that focus on them, and that's usually where the magic happens. Through these chapters, you find that the characters have some peculiar quirks, sometimes funny, sometimes irrational. For instance, Leia's is really into monsters, like really into them. Marcille is extremely against anything gross and has a stubborn fondness for the education she received. And Senshi is very stuck in his ways and has strong views on nutrition. Mind you, I'm trying to be careful with the spoilers here, but as far as these characters go, their personalities clash pretty often. For instance, you will have Marcille and Senshi clashing on the grounds of Marcille eating the food that's cooked, with Senshi usually winning. Another time you would have Senshi clash with Leios on monster behavior, and unfortunately for Senshi, it turned out Leios was right for that one, so that's a lesson for him. Another time you have Senshi clashing with Marcille over the use of magic, because he just doesn't like it. And, you know, there was the time that Senshi clashed with Chilchuck over the use of traps. So, if you can tell, Senshi is usually at the source of a lot of the conflict, and he's really the one that elevates the characters to that nuanced level in those first 30 chapters. He as a character himself is excellent. When it comes to him, he has biases, he has some naivety, he is irrational, he is stubborn, he is kind, he cares about his party, and he wants to succeed with them. Will you like him? Maybe not. But everything about him is justified and consistent with what is revealed in his backstory. The other 3 knew each other beforehand, so their interactions often don't cause the same level of friction that the interactions with a total stranger like Senshi does. But thanks to that, the nuances come out more readily. Senshi's insistence on him knowing the best cooking methods, for instance, pushes Marcille to want to prove that the knowledge she learned was worthwhile, which ends in a mishap, but also Senshi acknowledging that there was something to Marcille's book knowledge. It's little moments like these that are littered throughout the story, which give you little insights to what the characters hold dear and to what degree they will allow themselves to grow. Now, personally, in terms of who are my favorites, I really wanted to like Leios more, but for the first 30 chapters, Marcille easily takes the cake. She's just so funny, and her reactions are the best early on. She really makes the story so much more enjoyable, and she also ends up having a lot of screen time early on due to a lot of conflict with Senshi. After her is Senshi, not because I enjoy the character, but because I appreciate the care that goes into a particular character. Then there's Leios, and then Chilchuck. And these bottom 2, have a few problems when compared to the standard that the other 2 establish. Leios has just enough character chapters to inform you about him, but he's largely relegated to a support character for Marcille or Senshi, and also a plot pusher early on. Leios chapter 1 might be the worst iteration of the character for me, because he's the one that ends up having to establish the current arc goal and introduce the reader to the world, and also like push Marcille and Chilchuck along onto this adventure with him. Ultimately, the author tries for those first bits, but the impression I had in chapter 1 was one of wishing that I liked the character more, and also confusion of just trying to figure out if this guy was actually the main character. At the beginning though, he's serving less of the role of a main character and more of a plot enabler or an info dump. Chilchuck, on the other hand, is significantly worse off in the first 30 chapters, and there's a few reasons for that. First off, since the author tends to use conflict as a springboard for character development, there's going to be a problem if a character doesn't have a conflict with any other character, and that happens to Chilchuck often because Chilchuck happens to be relatively agreeable and he also likes to keep things close to his chest. It overall seems hard to get Chilchuck into conflict with other characters. One of its major conflicts though with Senshi only comes about when Chilchuck is doing his job of disarming traps, and the resolution of that particular conflict doesn't feel all that rewarding. If anything, it just feels like Senshi got his way and Chilchuck relented. Then there's also the factor that Chilchuck is a bit of a loner type character. Like I said before, he's more likely to keep his grievances to his chest, and because of that, he only really gets his character focused chapters when he's away from the group. Two notable chapters that I can think of occurred when he was away and thinking to himself or vented to someone else about his party. Now mind you, both characters hit their stride after the first 30 chapters, with Leos in particular really stepping up and Chilchuck leading the charge on the mystery of Senshi's background. For the first 30 chapters, the two though serve as good background pieces and occasional points of insight, but at the end of the day, Marcial and Senshi, they just reign supreme. At least impression wise, other readers might disagree with me on Chilchuck and Leos, but that's fine if you do. It doesn't change that for the first 30 chapters. I think without a doubt, Marcial and Senshi are the strongest ones. Anyway, that's the segment on characters. And now we're kind of wrapping up the video. Let's just go into like other little notes. There's a climax in the first 30 chapters and it's really good. It also does a really good job of setting up the second arc. Throughout the chapters, you have a secondary storyline being established that revolves around the world outside of the dungeon. And it's pretty cool, but it really gets going after those first 30 chapters, but at least the seeds are being spread throughout the first 30. Another note, there is a lot of adaptation of mythology by the author, and I love mythology, so I really love seeing what the author's doing with it in the series. Since it's about cooking, it also gives us a unique opportunity to see what the author can do with some of these mythological creatures. For instance, the basilisk, the author reimagines it. Well, it might be a chicken in some mythologies, but I thought it was a lizard. Anyway, the basilisk, chicken with a snake tail, and there's just a neat little bit of trivia about how the basilisk works in the world of Dungeon Meshi, where the chicken part of the animal is, or of the monster, is a tail, and the real part of it is actually the snake. There's also other little interesting things too, like the anatomy of a slime. I really love those applications of adaptations of the mythology, and they really make Dungeon Meshi really fun for me. And this is again one of those parts that elevates the cooking part, because it just tells you like nice cool trivia if you really like mythology. Mind you, it's not like actual like real life mythology, like it's just the author's adaptation of it. Let's just make that clear. And one last note, Marcial might arguably be the main character for the first 30 chapters. You just look at some of the things that the author does with her, the fact that she gets a lot of screen time. Mind you, like at the end of the day, we do have an ensemble cast here, and Leos is the one that's being positioned to be the main character because he is the party leader. But for that first 30 chapters, Marcial has as much of an emotional stake in this quest to find Leos' sister as Leos himself does. So it's really interesting to see how the focus kind of shifts from her back to Leos once you're out of that first arc. Anyway, that is my review of Dungeon Meshi, the first 30 chapters roughly. Let me know what you thought down below, and if you're a fan of Dungeon Meshi, let me know what you thought about this review. Was it fair? I sure hope it was. Overall, at the end of the day, this is a good story. This is a good manga. This is a worthwhile series if you like fantasy, if you even like a little bit of cooking on the side, if you like adventure. It's worthwhile. If you like exploration, definitely on the monster side, it's really good. Like I said, it's not the most exciting story, but that's because, this is equal parts exploring, equal parts trying out food, and then also uncovering the mysteries of the dungeon. And that's kind of where some of the excitement really comes from. It's from that mystery of the dungeon. But for the first 30 chapters, the characters are less focused on that mystery and more focused on, well, saving the sister. But after that, I do think it becomes interesting. Anyway, yeah, overall good stuff. Guys, let me know what you thought down below. Until next time, I hope you have an absolutely